When I first met Daniel Brooks, I thought he was just another patient. Quiet, with eyes that seemed to carry a weight I couldn't quite understand. He came to the hospital for routine checks. A tall, well-built man in his late 40s, with salt and pepper hair and a polite smile. His medical record mentioned only minor health issues, with nothing remarkable about it. I never expected that he would change my life, or that he and his wife would drag me into something much darker than I was prepared for. I entered his room, straightened my scrubs, and gave him a professional smile. "Good afternoon, Mr. Brooks." I greeted him, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling in my stomach. My heart was racing, but I brushed it off as just the nerves of starting a new job. It wasn't my first time helping a patient, but there was something different about him. "Everything okay?" I asked, noticing how he fidgeted on the bed. His gaze flickered to mine, then quickly away, almost like he was hiding something. "Yes. Just a bit uneasy," he replied, his voice steady but tight, making me feel like he was holding something back. I tried to ease the tension as I moved to adjust his gown, staying professional. But as I reached out, the gown shifted, and in that moment, I saw more than I had intended. My cheeks burned with embarrassment as I quickly looked away, pretending not to notice. "Let's get you set for your exam," I said, trying to sound calm. He was still watching me, and I noticed something new in his eyes. A flicker of intensity that unsettled and intrigued me. It was an almost intimate gaze for a clinical setting, and it made my hands tremble slightly. I finished quickly, gave him a polite smile, and left the room, trying to shake off the strange feeling that lingered. The next day, while doing my rounds, I received a message asking me to assist Mr. Brooks again. My heart fluttered. Why would he ask for me specifically? It felt like something more, and I couldn't ignore the little voice telling me to be cautious. When I entered his room, he greeted me with a warmer smile, more confident than before. "Thank you for coming, Sarah," he said softly, almost as if we shared some secret. "It's my job, Mr. Brooks," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. Our eyes met, and something passed between us that I didn't want to acknowledge. His calm, steady presence filled the room, and I found myself captivated. "You've been very kind to me. It's rare," he said quietly, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. Before I could respond, the door opened. I turned to see his wife, Claire Jacobs, a striking woman in her late 30s with a sharp, knowing gaze. She looked at us, her eyes moving between the two of us, and my pulse quickened. Without saying a word, she gave a tight nod and left the room. Mr. Brooks smiled, but his face had changed. It was as if he'd been caught. But instead of feeling guilty, he seemed amused. "My wife," he said simply. "A complex woman." I forced a tight smile and excused myself, my mind spinning as I closed the door behind me. There was an energy between him and Claire that I couldn't quite understand. Something more than just marital tension. In the following days, Mr. Brooks found ways to see me more frequently. Each encounter was charged with attention I couldn't ignore. One afternoon, as I reached for his foreline, he caught my hand, holding it a little too long. his touch lingering on my skin. I pulled away, more shaken than I wanted to admit. But the thrill that surged through me was undeniable. This wasn't just a patient anymore. He had crossed a line, and I had let it happen. Later that week, I was in the break room, trying to sort through my tangled emotions when Claire appeared beside me. Her presence both unexpected and intimidating. "Sarah," she said, her voice cool and sharp. "I need to talk to you." I nodded, trying to hide my unease, and followed her to an empty hallway. She faced me, her unreadable expression and dark eyes appraising me. "I know what you think you're doing," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "And I'm warning you. Stay away from him." My throat tightened, and I tried to respond. "Mrs. Jacobs, I don't know what you mean. I'm just his nurse." She tilted her head, a bitter smile on her lips. "Don't insult me, Sarah. I see the way he looks at you, and I see the way you look at him. But you need to understand something. Lucas isn't what he seems." A chill ran down my spine. Her warning felt less like jealousy and more like something darker. Something I didn't fully understand. Before I could question her further, she turned and walked away, leaving me with more questions than answers. That evening, as I was leaving the hospital, I saw Mr. Brooks waiting by the entrance, leaning casually against the wall. He looked up when he saw me, his eyes lighting up with a warmth I knew I should resist. "Sarah," he greeted, as if he'd been waiting for me all day. "Mr. Brooks," I replied, my tone firm, but my resolve weakened under his gaze. He stepped closer, the air between us electric. "Lucas," he corrected softly, coaxingly. "Lucas, this isn't appropriate," I stammered, trying to step back, but my feet felt stuck to the ground. "You don't need to be afraid of her," he said, his voice low and smooth, sending a shiver down my spine. "My wife, she likes to control things, but she can't control how I feel about you." Every part of me screamed to walk away, but his words stirred something dangerous inside me. It was intoxicating. This attention, this flirtation wrapped in secrecy. Yet deep down, I knew there was more to this than what met the eye. Just as he reached for my hand, Claire's cold voice interrupted. "Sarah?" I turned to see her standing behind us, her face an icy mask. She glanced at me, then at her husband. And in that moment, I understood. This was a game, but I wasn't sure of the rules. Her gaze was so sharp. It felt like she was seeing straight through me. Without a word, I pulled my hand free and walked away, leaving them both in the darkness. The following days were filled with tension, whispers, and messages from Mr. Brooks, asking to see me. I did my best to avoid him, but it was futile. He found ways to draw me back in, his gaze trapping me, his voice soft and pleading. One evening, Claire found me in a deserted hallway and stopped me, placing a hand on my arm. "Sarah, you need to know who he is," she said, her voice low, almost tender. She handed me a file, her fingers cold against mine. "Read this." Hesitant, I opened it and found photos and documents that painted a much darker picture of the man I thought I knew. He had a past full of secrets that sent a chill through me. I looked up at her. "Why are you showing me this?" She smiled, a dangerous glint in her eyes. "Because I want you to understand. Sarah. He's not who you think he is." It was then that I realized the complex web of attraction, jealousy, and power between Mr. and Mrs. Brooks was much more tangled than I had ever imagined. This wasn't just about infidelity or temptation. It was a game of control and manipulation. And I had been pulled into it without even realizing. As I walked away, my mind swirled with questions. Who is Mr. Brooks really? And what did his wife stand to gain from warning me about him? One thing was certain. I couldn't trust either of them. But the temptation to uncover the truth was a fire I couldn't extinguish. In the days that followed, I was torn between the powerful attraction I still felt for Mr. Brooks and the disturbing images and documents Claire had shown me. Dark thoughts crept into my mind every time I replayed her words. I felt trapped between their hidden agendas, as though they had both set traps for me, leaving me unable to trust anyone, not even myself. A week later, my phone chimed with a message while I was on a rare break in the staff lounge. It was from the hospital receptionist, and my heart sank when I read it. "Mr. Brooks has personally requested you for his evening appointment." The message felt like a hook pulling me back into their game. The tangled web between him and Claire. Though every rational part of me wanted to decline, I found myself standing outside his door that evening, steadying my breath before entering. When I opened the door, he looked up from the bed with a calm smile, as if nothing strange had ever happened between us. "Sarah," he said softly, his voice soothing yet calculated. "It's good to see you." I forced a polite smile, trying to keep the conversation brief. "I'm here to help with your evening checks," I said, reminding myself to keep things professional. He seemed to sense my guardedness. "I'm sorry," he said gently, almost apologetically, "about my wife. She can be intense. She had some concerns." I spoke carefully, my voice wavering as I remembered my earlier conversation with Claire. "Concerns about you." He sighed, his smile reappearing. "She doesn't understand," he added, his gaze never leaving mine. "What we have. This connection. It's real. Sarah. You can feel it. Can't you?" The vulnerability in his voice shook me. Despite everything I knew about him, part of me still wanted to believe him. Maybe Claire was wrong. Maybe he was just lonely, trapped in an unhappy marriage with a controlling wife. But then the photos, the documents, proof of something darker I couldn't forget. "I don't know what I feel," I admitted, stepping back trying to find clarity. "And I don't think this is appropriate. Mr. Brooks," I added, his name feeling odd on my lips. "Lucas," he corrected softly. "Please call me Lucas." His gaze softened, and for a moment he seemed like a man in need of saving. But just as I felt my walls beginning to crumble, I remembered Claire's warning, her cold smile as she handed me the files, the unsettling truths she had revealed. It all rushed back, and I knew I had to end this. "I think it's best if I ask another nurse to care for you from now on," I said, my voice firm despite my trembling hands. For a moment he looked taken aback, his face hardening slightly. You don't need to be afraid of her. Sarah, he said sharply. You don't need to be afraid of me either. There was an edge to his voice that sent a chill down my spine. I'm not afraid of you, I replied, though I didn't quite believe my own words. He leaned forward, his eyes darkening. Good, he murmured, his voice a whisper that felt more like a threat than reassurance. Because I have a way of getting what I want. That night I tossed and turned, my mind racing with fragments of every conversation I'd had with him and with his wife. They were both playing a game. That much was clear. But I didn't know who was holding the winning hand. Or if I'd been the prize they'd been after all along. Days passed. And I managed to avoid him, carefully dodging his requests and swapping shifts when possible. But despite my best efforts, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. I'd catch glimpses of him in the hallway, his eyes following me, his smile almost taunting. Every now and then I'd feel a pair of eyes on me that weren't his. Claire Jacobs would appear just long enough for me to notice her. Her gaze cold and piercing, reminding me that she was still there, still aware of everything. Then one evening, as I was finishing up my last shift, I heard a voice behind me. Sarah. I turned around to see Claire Jacobs standing in the dim light of the hallway, her expression unreadable. She looked at me, her gaze sharp as a knife. I need to show you something, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It's about Lucas. I hesitated, but the urgency in her tone pulled me in. Silently, she led me down a quiet corridor, away from the bustling hospital ward and into an empty office. She shut the door behind us, her movements calm and deliberate. You need to know the truth, she began, her voice laced with bitterness. About my husband. My heart pounded as she handed me another file, her hand lingering a moment longer, her eyes narrowing as she looked into mine. You're not the first. You know, she said, her voice almost pitying. He's done this before. Many times. I opened the folder, and my breath caught as I scanned the pages. They were full of emails, printed out messages with other women, other nurses. The same words, the same charm, the same haunting look in their eyes as he played his game, winning them over, making them feel special before he discarded them. My stomach twisted as I realized the depth of his deception. Why are you showing me this? I asked, my voice shaky. Because, she replied, her tone cold and firm. I don't want to lose to him. He's done this for too long, and he needs to be stopped. She leaned in, her eyes narrowing. We can end this together, Sarah. But I need you to play along just a little longer. My mind reeled. She was asking me to stay close to him, to act as though nothing had changed. But now I'd be a part of her plan, a pawn in her game of revenge. In the weeks that followed, I did as she asked, keeping up appearances and pretending that I was still swayed by Mr. Brooks' charm. I visited his room regularly, masking my true emotions, and watched as he continued his game, unaware that his wife and I were now working together. With each encounter, I gathered information, collecting every piece of evidence that Claire requested. I was careful, watching him closely, waiting for him to slip, to reveal his true nature. But as the days wore on, I found myself growing more conflicted. He was still the same charming, enigmatic man I'd first met. And despite everything I knew about him, I couldn't completely shut off the feelings he stirred in me. I hated myself for it. But there was a part of me that still yearned for his attention. That thrill of the forbidden that had first drawn me to him. One evening, he finally confronted me, his tone laced with frustration. "Sarah, you've been distant," he murmured, reaching for my hand. His gaze filled with that same intensity that had once ensnared me. "Is there something wrong?" I pulled my hand back, forcing a smile. "No, Lucas. Everything's fine." But he wasn't convinced. His eyes narrowed, and I saw a flicker of suspicion. He was catching on, realizing that something had changed. I felt a surge of fear, wondering if he knew about my alliance with his wife. If he was already planning his next move. Later that night, Claire Jacobs sent me a message. Her words urgent and filled with urgency. "Meet me in the office now." I slipped away from the ward, finding her waiting in the same empty room where we'd met before. She looked more on edge than I'd ever seen her. Her face pale, her hands clenched. "It's time," she said, her voice low. "Tonight, we put an end to this. I have everything I need." She handed me a key, her expression fierce. "You know what to do." I felt a surge of fear and anticipation as I took the key, realizing that this was it. The moment we'd been waiting for. I would go into his room one last time under the guise of another routine check. But this time, armed with every piece of damning evidence we had against him. I hesitated, glancing back at her, unsure if I was ready to follow through. But she nodded, her gaze steely. "Do it, Sarah. End this once and for all." As I made my way down the dimly lit hallway, my heart thundered in my chest. I felt the weight of every choice I'd made, every line I'd crossed. And I knew that after tonight, there would be no turning back. I took a deep, steadying breath as I reached the door to his room, clutching the key Claire Jacobs had given me like a lifeline. My mind was racing, a tangle of thoughts and emotions I couldn't seem to untangle. But this was it. The end of the game. One way or another. I would leave this room with the truth and finally escape their web of deceit. The room was dim, quiet, except for the soft hum of the medical monitors. Mr. Brooks lay back on the bed, his eyes closed. For a moment, I thought he might be asleep. But as I moved closer, his eyes opened and he looked at me with that familiar gaze, both inviting and unsettling. "Sarah," he murmured, a soft smile touching his lips. "I didn't think you'd come back tonight." "Why wouldn't I?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light, though my heart was pounding in my chest. I forced myself to remember why I was here. To stick to the plan. He reached out, his hand hovering just over mine. "You seem distant," he said softly. "And I've missed you." The sincerity in his voice almost shook my resolve. But I knew what he was. What he'd done to countless others. I couldn't let his charm sway me. Not now. "I think we should talk, Lucas," I said, my voice trembling as I forced the words out. "About everything." His expression changed subtly, a flicker of weariness in his eyes. but he quickly masked it, giving me that same charming smile. "Of course," he replied smoothly, gesturing for me to sit beside him. I took a seat, barely noticing the edge of the bed under me as I clutched the file I'd brought. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "Your wife?" I began. "She told me things. Showed me things about you." He stilled, his face losing some of its warmth. "My wife?" he began slowly, his voice dropping as if weighing his words carefully. "My wife doesn't understand me, Sarah. You know that. She has her own issues. She's always trying to control everyone around her. Even me. I thought you could see that." I opened the file, my hands shaking as I held up the documents and photographs Claire Jacobs had given me. The messages. The intimate photos with other nurses. Women he'd charmed, manipulated, and discarded. I forced myself to look him in the eye. These women. They thought you cared about them. Like you led me to believe you cared about me. For a moment, he just stared at the photographs, his face unreadable. Then a slow, chilling smile crept over his lips. "Sarah," he said softly, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You think you're any different?" The words hit me like a slap and a shiver ran down my spine. He leaned in closer, his face mere inches from mine, his eyes dark and intense. "You were so easy to convince," he murmured, his tone dripping with derision. "So willing to see the best in me, to ignore all the warning signs. Just like the others." A wave of nausea swept over me as the reality of his words sank in. He played me like he had played all the others. I felt sick. Not only for believing him, but for letting myself be drawn so deeply into his twisted game. "I trusted you," I whispered, feeling the weight of my own foolishness. He laughed softly. A hollow, bitter sound. "That's the thing, Sarah. You're all so eager to believe the lie, to think you're special. But you're not." He leaned back, his gaze cold and calculating. "And neither is my wife." I gripped the file, every nerve in my body screaming to leave, to run as far as I could from him. But I knew I couldn't. Not yet. "So what now?" I managed to ask, my voice shaking. "That depends," he replied, his tone smooth again. "You could forget all of this. Walk away and I won't hold it against you." His smile twisted. "You could make this harder on yourself. But I wouldn't recommend it." In that moment, I realized he wasn't only manipulating me. He was threatening me. I stood up, my legs shaky. But I refused to let him see how terrified I was. "You're not gonna get away with this," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Your wife knows everything. She's not afraid of you anymore." His smile faltered, a brief flash of anger crossing his face. "She won't do anything," he muttered, almost to himself. "She's always been too weak to stand up to me. And now I have all the evidence I need to make sure she keeps her mouth shut." Just then, the door to the room creaked open, and Claire Jacobs stepped inside, her face a mask of steely determination. She glanced between us, her gaze settling on me with a hint of approval before turning to her husband. "You're right, Lucas," she said coldly. "I've been too weak. But not anymore." He looked at her, a mixture of shock and anger darkening his features. "What do you think you're doing?" he spat, his calm facade finally cracking. "I'm taking back control," she replied, her voice steady. She held up a small recorder, her finger hovering over the play button. "And I have everything I need." His eyes widened, a flicker of panic flashing across his face as he realized what she'd done. She'd recorded our entire conversation. Every vile word he'd said. Every threat. Every admission. And now she held the power. "You won't get away with this," he sneered, his voice low and dangerous. But there was fear there too. Fear he couldn't quite mask. Claire Jacobs only smiled, her expression calm and composed. "You've underestimated me, Lucas. Just like you underestimated Sarah. But I'm done playing by your rules." With that, she turned to me, her gaze softer, more vulnerable. "Sarah, I know I asked you to help me. And I know this hasn't been easy. But it's over now." I nodded, relief flooding through me as I realized I was finally free. I didn't need to stay in this twisted game any longer. She had everything she needed to bring him down, to put an end to his manipulation once and for all. As I walked out of that room, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, a sense of liberation I hadn't felt in weeks. I was done with Lucas Brooks, done with the lies and the games. And I knew that no matter what came next, I'd never let anyone hold that kind of power over me again. In the weeks that followed, rumors spread around the hospital about Mr. Brooks and his wife. I didn't ask for the details. I didn't want to know. All I knew was that Claire Jacobs had finally found the courage to expose the truth. And Lucas had faced consequences he couldn't manipulate his way out of. As for me, I found peace in moving forward, knowing I had escaped something dangerous, something dark that had nearly consumed me. I returned to my work, my life, and the things that mattered most. Stronger, wiser, and forever changed.